Welcome to another one of the lecture series in the project-based learning workshops. Today what we're going to talk about is how to both plan and situate project-based learning within a broader perspective of what participants are involved and how they're involved. In doing so, it's going to help us refine both our course activities, our schedule, and also ways of giving feedback and particularly in selecting tactics that will enhance the work. In this particular workshop, we're going to talk more about how the planning and the participants and the larger purpose of a project-based learning course can help us both to develop and situate the other aspects of the project. We've learned that inquiry-based education throughout our series of workshops so far is difficult because it asks us to think differently about what the class is purpose for and how we align that then with the learning objectives, how we try to scaffold then a whole series of different events and activities and modules. And so then we're helping to coach this idea of designing and progressing and interpreting and researching work through a certain perspective. All of it then needs some refinement because there's different ways of situating project-based learning activities. So we're going to talk through several of those today. This is such a basic question, and I wish that there was an easy answer to it. What should I use? What approach should I use for an inquiry-based education? The reason that there's no easy answer is because course objectives vary, and as we'll see, who's involved with the project also varies. I want you to think through these different approaches and the different kind of diagrams of how they work. Let's use one example of a course in social media. Now, what the purpose of the class is and how the class is taught and what the learning objectives are will vary between should this be problem-based, should it be project-based, or should it be sort of a broader design thinking. Briefly then, if we talk about this from a problem-based point of view, this could be the problem is design a social media platform for one particular client. The teacher in this case has defined what the problem is. That's one of the key components to problem-based. They set forth the problem, and yet there's still several different proposals and objectives that would be plausible. So in other words, there's a real inquiry that's involved with how students get from the project that they're given to the proposals that they have. A project-based approach may look for more guiding questions with that. And these guiding questions could be, what is the nature of a healthy social media platform? Students then don't have a final necessarily thing in mind. They would have to start discovering and researching about that. They end that module and work their way towards interpreting it, and end that module, work their way towards ideating and making then things that are similar to a problem-based proposal. In this case, of course, at this point of the module, when it switches to a problem-based proposal, that the problem itself is not necessarily of the making for the not made by the teacher, but is as a result of the student work from the discovery and interpretation. Ideating, testing, eventually evaluating, and then there's a public presentation of the artifact related to that. Where a design thinking might be even more open-ended if this is what an instructor had wanted, and it could be, what's the purpose of social media? There's no clear endpoint, there's no clear problem or proposal. And so with that, then the students could find themselves with a much broader, more open-ended, what are we supposed to be learning and why are we supposed to be learning it? Now look, they're going to go through the same process of both discovering and interpreting this and ideating and experimenting and maybe evolving their thinking. But the key to design thinking is that it's okay to have many, many different trajectories of the student work that comes out of here. Now, I don't think that it's necessarily okay that if student work goes completely in the opposite direction. Of course, we need to be able to have this idea of going from where the project starts to what the end point is. But design thinking then is intended to be more wide open. How then do you pick? Which one should you do? How do you align it with your overall course objectives? I would just ask that you take a step back. Ask yourself, what's the fundamental purpose of our teaching? Think to yourself, for whom are you teaching? What principles then guide that work? The work of not only teaching, but preparing the class and who's involved with the class. And really ask what we teach and how we teach, again, through the broader perspective then of the fundamental purpose of this teaching. Because once we start to think about what we teach and how we teach, then it'll help answer the questions then of whether this is a problem-based or project-based, whether design thinking is the approach that we want. Understanding then the purpose of this work will help determine then what we teach and how we teach. For me, I think a lot about these difficult problems and these wicked problems. And one of the purposes of project-based learning and inquiry-based learning is it positions itself through the course activities and the planning and even the participants to help actually address some of these multifaceted problems. So if you look at the problems here with the World Economic Forum and how it's going from human sciences and to agriculture and water and energy, and if you think about a traditional course in which skills and knowledge are taught about it, like say a very well defined discipline, it's difficult then to tie in all these different other disciplines and how those disciplines are related specifically to what's being taught. If the purpose of your class is to show how all of these things are aligned, or how they could be aligned, or how all these different systems in fact work together, then you can start to think about a delivery system for the class, and in fact a course format that would allow students and learners maybe to see how these different things are related. This isn't suggesting that everything could be solved, but if you take an inquiry-based approach, this inquiry-based approach through the research project and the interpretation aspects of it will find these different connections. And if it's an inquiry-based approach, we know that then those inquiries in those different directions may lead to new and unique trajectories for the work. So if you look at the purpose of why inquiry-based education, we know that this inquiry-based, whether it's the Kolb or the Bloom taxonomy, has a higher order thinking skills that are developed, and that we know that project-based learning is a high impact practice. We know that in doing these things, by using the different qualities of a project-based format, that meaningful experiences can be made. We know that what we're teaching isn't just a topic, but in fact it's a tool. It's a tool that students can use later for inquiry, investigation, and they learn to collaborate. We know that if they go through this process, that they learn to engage, and then because they're more engaged, their enthusiasm is higher, which actually increases their retention. The purpose then is, if we're going to teach difficult topics, we should teach difficult topics in a way that has these other benefits that go along with them. But it isn't just as simple as saying, I would like to do inquiry-based education. What's the nature of what inquiry is going to take place? Because then in doing so, it helps us to figure out the different format. How can we, if we wanted to have learning about interdisciplinary topics, how can that occur? If we're trying to situate this within an authentic framework, again, how does that occur? If student voice and choice is important, how can we make sure that the actual activities within the class are both meaningful and collaborative? If the purpose of the course is to promote critical action, in other words, to do more than just critical thinking, but critical action that results from the critical thinking, what format, what specific then set of activities might allow that to happen? What I hope is evident is that these types of questions, what's the purpose of the teaching, for whom, and what is it that we teach, is in fact intended to be one of our guiding questions, one of the broader possibilities that we have. Learning how to format a project-based learning course is itself, of course, a problem-based and project-based question that you need to resolve. Thinking about what the purpose of the class is and what is taught and how it's taught is, of course, part of this discovery process. You then can quickly move to interpret that. Interpreting it then leads to a planning process for it. Ideation is how you're going to test out your ideas in this scaffolding and what activities are going to happen. Testing can occur in the classroom, and then evaluation can be something that happens both through a plus delta formative feedback model, student evaluations, or other ways in which you can, in fact, try to understand if what you did was effective or not. So what I'd recommend for the first part of trying to figure out the discovery aspects of it is just think about the framework of who's involved and what's being taught. I have 3 different options here that are commonly used for both project-based and problem-based, which I'm now, for the remainder of this, simply going to call inquiry-based education. You have the idea of a traditional approach, and in this traditional approach, there's of course the instructor, and the instructor is an expert in one particular discipline. And then the project itself is based on a disciplinary specific topic. The students then are enrolled in that particular major, and so you have an engagement around a particular topic. So the inquiry is all around that particular disciplinary topic, and clearly this is about developing expertise with one kind of focused perspective. However, we could go with more of a coordinated approach. It depends on your actual topic. If one of your topics was intentionally transdisciplinary, if the perspective of it and the learning objective of it was intended to have people see the multifaceted nature and complicated nature of the problem, if that was the case, I would definitely suggest that you think about formatting this where you have different instructors with different disciplines, have different perspectives on how that actually discipline could be taught and seen. With that, try to invite students from different majors and different topics in which they can then, you have this we know that inquiry-based education is always then a two-way exchange of information. And it's not just, instructors telling students what to know. It's always focused around the topic itself. So think about opening that up to different majors of different topics. There's another way of doing this, of course, is if we think about these transdisciplinary topics, that it doesn't just happen within a bubble. Okay, it can happen within a bubble and oftentimes does in academia, but it doesn't mean that it has to. There's lots of ways in which service learning and community engagement can be part of this educational process. And in doing so, it's a transdisciplinary topic, and that the community is actually part of this topic. So instructors give feedback and students give feedback all around this, and even then the community gives feedback and is part of this overall exploration. If you've taught any of these different types of formats that I'm showing you here, you realize how incredibly different they are in terms of the activities that happen, how they're planned, and the schedule. There's a familiarity of expectations with the instructor and the student about what this course is about when it's this traditional course. It's like a major-based course. So it can still be project-based or problem-based, and this familiarity reduces some of the unknown. So like, if this is an architecture class or if it's a biochemistry class, like, we know what we're doing. We know we can build upon those particular skills. We can even situate this within a larger curriculum. Now, however, within that format, there's still many, many options. The teacher and student roles could be traditional, teacher-centric, or this could be more of the mutual-centric or even the learner-centric approach. Just because it's disciplinary specific doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it, and it certainly doesn't mean that it can't be inquiry-based, supportive, mutual learning. In fact, if we expand upon just this idea that it's a disciplinary major, this doesn't have to happen with one class. Within a particular discipline, within a curricula, there could be a sequence. Then within this sequence, then you're learning inquiry-based education on different levels of expertise. An exposure level, which usually happens at the beginning level of students, an intermediate or capacity building level in which they learn to do more and more problem or inquiry-based educational activities, and then of course the advanced and the responsibility stage in which the expectations of what is learned and what's produced is elevated. In doing so, then what you have is in fact a sequence. So instead of just relying on one particular class, you're relying on many classes, and within these classes, they can still be with an instructor who's an expert and with students that are disciplinary specific. But instead of just learning about biochemistry 201, you can learn about biochemistry and food nutrition, and then experiment with this on different classes throughout an education. Let's see if we can visualize this in one way. So maybe like a problem-based learning could be designing of an urban food center. And so with this, the setup of the class would be very disciplinary specific. We know that within there'd be lots of different potential solutions. We know there'd be both creative and or technical work that would go along with this. And because it's disciplinary specific, there could be focus, skills, and knowledge that could be part of what each module is set up to do, but it's intentionally limited in its scope. Now, the deliverable also then would be part of this problem-based learning. In this case, it could be either a business plan or an actual design of it. It's still specific then to that discipline. But here's another example of how something could be disciplinary specific, but much more open-ended in terms of its inquiry. In this particular inquiry, this was a series of senior level architecture and structural students. In that, it was an open-ended design competition in which they were looking for different ways to be able to incorporate a shading structure. In this shading structure, because they already had the capacity to learn how to do project-based learning throughout the rest of their education, they were able to take what they learned and actually inquire in different ways. You can see a full set of skills and knowledge that were involved here. This is important because when you start to leverage this inquiry-based approach across an education, you don't just have to have a particular set of problems, but in fact, you can watch students learn and embrace that learning themselves as they see the potential for inquiry-based. Let's say within your curricula that a choice is made that transdisciplinary engagement would be beneficial, either as a reflection of real-world issues or as a way of teaching soft skills or teamwork, or maybe it's an introduction to the complexity of a topic, and perhaps it's just a way of developing a broader set of courses within your college or department. So what matters most about doing this is that there's a guiding question and the anticipated deliverables that will matter the most. So when you have this transdisciplinary topic, it's no longer as simple as, do a business plan. You can't just have a set of focused skills and knowledge because we know that it's both a transdisciplinary topic. We know that you have instructors from different disciplines, and you also have learners who come from different disciplines. This then enhances the challenge of what can we expect to be produced, right? So your guiding questions in these initial phases will help to have to guide them to see what we're going to do when we're done, what's expected of us. So we also have some complications with tactics. When you have different disciplines, and especially let's say, for instance, that one of the disciplines was STEM and one was a non-STEM discipline. And part of that then is a practice and conditioning of what you learn in your previous classes in education and what's been expected of you, specifically with inquiry-based education. Engineers see the word design different than, say, architects see the word design. Where engineers see design as a verification of an actual model, where architects see a whole series of different possibilities. And so if you start to put discipline A and discipline B together, and students from discipline A and discipline B together, being very, very clear about what activities are going to happen and how they're going to happen and what is expected to be produced is important. If we took that same idea of an urban food development program and had this as a transdisciplinary topic with different teachers co-taught and different students, then we would see as the scope somehow is going to have to change. It intentionally then is going to have to involve multiple disciplines in it. In this case, maybe it's about transportation and urban systems, or it's food distribution systems. And in this then, proposals are usually going to be more important than just solutions. Generally, these could be broader, thinking that there's sort of one solution. Once you open it up to multiple disciplines, then we start to actually try to understand the relationships of these disciplines to each other, instead of here's one particular proposal, this is the right answer. Deals with much more sort of systems design thinking and understanding the interrelationship between these things, and of course a collaborative learning process, the soft skill process involved with this. You could take this approach, and this is approached by an architect and engineer named Friato. He took this approach in his speculative work, in both his teaching work and his professional work, in which he would design air-based systems, and these air-based structural systems was used generally as a broad idea for what if these were movable greenhouses? What if they had a water collection system? So I'm showing you this as an example because this is one way of thinking about how that as a project inquiry could be valid. And yet the deliverables then with Friato was he was really showing how it could be engineered and how the strength of the membrane itself could withstand the forces of holding it up. Now, it could be a totally different deliverable, right? The deliverables could be what sort of plants are in here, how many plants could we get, how much water is able to be collected. So it's a broader idea of urban food, or even, how we have portable buildings. But what's delivered then is the key. But let's say there's a desire to have a community entity that's also involved with this. It's not just a transdisciplinary topic, and there's not just co-taught. It's maybe not just students from different majors, but there is a community that's involved as well. So I would ask you to think about, what do you mean when you have community, and what does community involvement actually look like? Is it just money as a sponsored studio? Is there a direct engagement in which students interact with the community? Is it indirect? Is it just advocacy? By having community involved, we know that it helps to situate the learning. We know that it improves active construction, and it increases the authenticity of a project-based learning course. Everything maybe seems real and purposeful to both the students and instructors. What's the purpose of the community's involvement in this? Is it just to provide that level of authenticity and sort of a reality of it? Is the community's involvement in this that they provide answers? Does the community get something from the student involvement? Because when you start to think about how that works, then when you plan it, how does the community interact with students? How do they interact with the community? Is the community actually part of this transdisciplinary topic? Does instructor feedback and student feedback come in through the entity, and then the entity then determines what happens with the particular topic and or solution? Is that the way that the workflow works? Is that the way everything would happen within this? A problem-based approach to a community-engaged setup here could be design and build a shelter. And this shelter that was designed and built by myself and my colleague, Professor Doyle, had a series of graduate students. We knew the site. We knew generally the scope of the shelter. So it was an intentionally narrow site. The faculty coordinated the engagement. And so then the students themselves found themselves actually building it, helping pick the materials, how those materials would go together. So is the engagement within the community the lesson? Meaning that they're actually working towards doing something for the community, meeting with the community? Is it just the skill of them learning how to build and how to deal with materials? Is it both? And can it be both? Let's do the broadest possible idea then and just say it's a community engaged design thinking process. And in that, what would be a question that would be open-ended? Is urban food equitable? So versus what we saw in the first thing, where it's kind of a direct and disciplinary specific, where all we were really talking about was designing this particular space here, or we had a co-taught multidisciplinary thing where they were maybe looking at different systems of infrastructure and buildings. In this one, it's a much broader thing. Is urban food equitable? In fact, does it even need a site? Does it even have a site? So it's the broadest possible scope. In this, again, we're looking for more proposals than we are solutions. There's various plausible activities that could happen with here. I'm hoping a few of those examples help shed light a little bit more on the planning and the purpose of the course. All that is meant to help you figure out which inquiry-based approach will be used, maybe the benefits of using different ones, and how that might then align with your larger objectives. So I'm going to use a couple of visualization techniques as we go forward here to sort of compare and contrast different items as we go forward of just the means of exploration of inquiry-based. I've shown a similar diagram of this explaining the workflow for a project-based approach many times. And the basics here, I think, are absolutely correct. You start with a larger guiding question. There's a purpose on one end, and there's an expectation that there's a deliverable on the other end here. And of course, what I was always trying to show with this diagram is that when you start, there's a whole lot of different options. This is wide, but those options intentionally narrow as we go forward. Right? The role of discovery and interpretation is meant to actually narrow these options and narrow these options. We've talked always about how one activity is always linked to what happens before it. But as I plan any inquiry-based course that I participate in, I actually start to think of it this way, both with, as you can see, a top of here, a schedule, and that schedule then with the different modules, the modules then aligning with the end of a particular inquiry. But what you'll notice is that the cone varies here. And the cone varies because in this case, I'm not actually showing the number of options and how those narrow. What I'm actually showing is the work that's produced. And so as we start off here, we start off with there's sort of no work that's produced as evidence of the course design. Discovery has more. Interpretation actually produces more. As we ideate and test, there's more and more and more. By that, again, if we still think about this as linked learning across the different phases, what happens is by the time someone gets to a prototyping or evaluation phase, there's a broad set of work upon which this can be reflected upon. More and more work is produced, right? It always increases and expands. It's developing essentially a portfolio of work. One of the great joys of teaching, I think, is watching them link this learning from one activity to another. They learn to trust themselves. They learn to see that the research matters and it has a consequence and impact to the future work. And this is exactly what you want to see, specifically with like a team building work and cooperative work. When you look at the overall semester schedule that's overlaid upon here, I've made this, of course, pretty regular. And we can see that it's, regular check-ins of a couple weeks, a couple weeks, a couple weeks, a couple weeks. This, of course, is not always going to be the case. And that's what we get into with the next few projects here. Depending on what your course format is, will also depend upon how much time they spend on different activities. And the beauty of an inquiry-based process here is that we have this variability based on your objectives. So the guiding question, let's say in this one, isn't as open-ended. For instance, let's say the guiding question is, how do we use less rainwater to produce more crops in a greenhouse? The research then can be incredibly focused. And so because it's incredibly focused on one particular problem or question, you can narrow that down to like 1 week of time. You can also see that perhaps the class is more focused on developing design and performance tools and skills. So you can interpret exactly what those mean in order to get to the point where we're spending 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks then of ideating here, but then look at how much time is dedicated back here. So not only are we then ideating, but developing actual prototype skills and tools. And maybe because that's the class is trying to figure out cost, production, effectiveness. If again, this is about like rainwater in greenhouses, because that's really effective, maybe what we found in the project-based learning thing is the distinction here has to do with how to prototype to make even moderate advancements. So what would change here if the course setup was more of a community engagement / service learning course, in which then the expression of engagement is the objective? That instead of, say, narrowing the focus to developing different prototypes to maximize the amount of rainwater within a greenhouse, instead, different means of engaging within a community and, developing those skills of how one engages with a community through this topic. Obviously, what you see is that it would have to change quite a bit, and that a larger portion of it is probably about this discover and empathize phase. Ideating might be relatively limited because perhaps the scope of the project is limited, because then working with communities and community consultation and getting the feedback and responding to that feedback, again, probably takes a great deal of time. Testing what's done, revising what's done, and coming up with a final proposal might be relatively direct. These might actually be things that require 10 times this amount of work and have to be passed on to a different semester. Obviously, it all comes back to what's the purpose of the class, who's involved with the class, so that we can start to set up this module alignment. This is a very common question that I have oftentimes. Is this okay if I have an inquiry-based course idea and that I really only have time to have students go through the discover and empathy phase and maybe interpret it before they make their final presentation and proposal? In that, what we find out that there's sort of a series of miscellaneous, maybe direct problems that happen after this, maybe some skill building exercises, but what happens after this final proposal is not necessarily related directly to the project. Is this okay? I mean, look, of course it's okay. If this is the purpose of what you're trying to do, if this is one of the skills that you're trying to teach, this one to me seems like it's one of those phase one in a curricula in which you're actually trying to teach the process. You're not so much worried about a holistic overall expression of an inquiry-based education. So of course that this is okay. Here's where it gets tricky. Is this okay? Meaning, what if at the beginning of a semester there is a whole series of miscellaneous direct problems? A series of sort of skill building exercises, but these things were not related to the project directly. And then at a certain point in the semester, students are told, okay, develop ideas and then test these ideas. But that it's not then related back to the interpretation phase that we normally see, right? And the discovery phase that usually starts everything off. What happens then when this tries to exist on its own? So can we do this? Look, you can. And yes, something will happen with student learning, and they can build something and they can prototype something, and there's something always learned by actually doing. And incrementally, this is obviously better than just a one-way learning, but this also sometimes follows the cookbook approach to labs, meaning yes, they're doing by learning, but that it's a step-by-step thing that's generally laid out for them. So it's untethered. If you start only with the prototyping or design phase and evaluation phase, it's untethered to what's happened before. So what happens is it's not necessarily situated. It's not authentic. You lose an accountability of this process that happens before. And so students then see almost anything as plausible for what they could design or what they could evaluate, because it's not anchored back. So you can never, ever do this if you're just like dropping in on a community and saying, hey, we've got a solution and here it is. So this wouldn't work for that. This might work for smaller, maybe disciplinary specific processes. But if you really are interested in learning by doing and design and evaluation, it's really not useful to have miscellaneous direct problems that happen before that don't directly contribute to what happens after. So hopefully what you see by thinking about this format and the approach and who's involved is it helps tie back into many of the things that we've talked about in other workshops here. We talked about in the intro classes to project-based learning that there's philosophies and features and formats like why project-based learning, what do you learn from it? We've talked through how to develop it in the first phases, different ways of designing the purposes and the format, basically what to expect. We talked through, of course, different aspects of interpretation and assessment, how we nurture feedback, what kind of exercises are important, how we sort of measure progress as we go through, even the design and ideation process, both the different tools and the tactics, how that relates to what's being learned and how it's learned, which gets you back to where you are now. Just saying that you want to do an inquiry-based approach isn't enough. We'll want to think through whether it is just a disciplinary specific with both instructor and students, and if it is disciplinary specific, what does that mean to the overall schedule and the phases of the work as it goes through? If it's, say, transdisciplinary with different disciplines and different majors, maybe that transdisciplinary thing is much more involved in trying to understand, what design ideas and how to test those design ideas. And if so, then you find that this approach might lead to that format, that schedule. If a community is involved, then we might align this and see what we saw before, where there's a lot more work in this discover and empathy. Of course, it doesn't mean that these all align directly. You could have a traditional approach that in fact uses that. This is what's important, to go back to the overall purpose of what you're doing and why you're doing it, so that when you're doing this planning, that you don't just see it maybe necessarily as an abstract idea. You're starting to understand the purpose and what's taught and how it's taught as a way of establishing a framework that allows you to then help cultivate these different phases of an inquiry-based approach. Once you have this idea of what's being taught, to whom, from there you can dig into a lot more of the specifics from the other workshops that we've talked about. What tactics then can be aligned based on what we know? For instance, you might find that coached ideation and case study method are absolutely perfect, and those need to be used more and more and more. You might actually then develop tools and work production based on this. How much ideation, how much testing needs to be done? And so you say, well, we will be using this particular tool for the class. How much teamwork and collaboration is involved is obviously associated with, in this case, the setup of the class and the schedule of the class. Your tactics then, cooperative learning is a tactic that would be used if you had more teamwork. Even the techniques for assessment, understanding then whether assessment is disciplinary specific or whether assessment then for something that would be, say, a community engaged project would be quite different. All of it then brings you back to, if you wanted to start with the backwards design approach and start with the final presentation and artifact, what does that mean? So reflect back upon some of these issues. If you start with an inquiry-based approach, then you can try to make distinctions between whether it is a problem-based or project-based or design thinking, or frankly, whether you want to make any particular distinction at all. All of it, of course, is meant to cultivate, and the larger purpose of it is meant to be able to cultivate both the process of learning and what's learned, or maybe allow you to get access to more complicated issues, more complicated sort of thoughts that maybe don't exist with another means of inquiry that aren't the same as either a project or problem-based approach.